our text today, the two most emotional experiences in my life were my wedding day and the birth of my 3 children. When I do premarital counseling, I tell the engaged couple that there is nothing that can prepare you for the emotions that are going to hit you on your wedding day. See, during the service, when I'm the one officiating it and I get to stand up there with the groom and all the groomsmen, before the back doors open and before everybody sees the bride, I lean over to the groom and I say, "This is the best part. Because you're not going to remember anything I say from here on out because you're going to be so captivated by what you see." Man, seeing the bride adorned and prepared for her husband is a sight to behold, isn't it? But what else are people interested besides seeing the bride for the first time? They're interested in seeing the groom when he sees the bride for the first time. When I saw Kristen adorned, when I saw her beaming radiantly coming to me, I absolutely lost it. I could not contain or control the emotions that I had been feeling that whole day. Nothing can prepare you for the emotions you feel on your wedding day. And then nothing can prepare you for the emotions that you'll feel when your children are born. I mean, the 9 months leading up to Rebecca's birth was absolutely new to me. Everything was new to me, and I had no idea what to expect. So we bought books. We talked with people. We went and enlisted in a Le Mans class, which was very educational because I had never seen a birth before. And we saw a video of it. And I had no idea all the stuff that happens. It almost made me not want to be in the room when the baby was born. But all this to say is that when the baby was born, though, when it was yours, when it was my child, nothing could prepare me for the flood of the emotions of seeing it and then holding that precious, goggly goop of a baby for the first time. Lost it. Couldn't contain myself. And then after the children are born, we don't just give them random names, do we? No, we put a lot of thought into the naming of our children. I mean, we did a lot of research, man. We discussed what's your favorite name, boy name? What's your favorite girl name? And back and forth it went. And then we went to great lengths to come up with meaningful names for each of our children. Well, at least that's what we did with Rebecca, because David and Jonathan, there was no discussion on what their names were going to be. Because of the friendship that I have with my older brother, Jeff, when I became a believer in college, I began to pray early on, saying, "God, please give me 2 boys and a girl." And I wanted the 2 boys first so that they could protect a girl and beat up any other boy so I wouldn't have to, right? But God had other plans because we had Rebecca first. But if we did have 2 boys, there was no discussion. Because of David's friendship with Jonathan, I wanted to name my 2 boys, David and Jonathan. See, naming a child, it is a big deal, isn't it? Because our names carry meaning. Our names communicate character. And last week, I introduced you to this incredible book that has been called the second greatest story ever told. And I warned you, though, that it's not an easy book to read, because it's going to be a book that's going to reveal to us the reality of our relationship to God. This is going to be a book that's going to clearly show you. And it's not going to be easy to see. And then we investigated the question last week, why did God choose the metaphor of marriage to describe our relationship to Him? Why does God want us to see Him as our heavenly husband? And I argued that we cannot understand God and that we cannot understand our relationship to Him until we understand Him as our bridegroom. And the reason why is because marriage is the most intimate and enduring relationship there is. Marriage takes priority over every other relationship. And no other relationship can impact, has the power to affect you the way marriage does. So Hosea, it's a passionate love story. But it's a passionate love story that's gone bad. And the result is a very dysfunctional and wayward family. See, Hosea's marriage, it's a living parable. It's a living parable of God's relationship to his people. What Hosea experiences with Gomer is what God experiences with us. This is why I've entitled this series, Yahweh Loves the Loveless. You see, it's not just because we are unlovable and unlovely at times in our relationship with God. No, it's that we are actually loveless towards God. We spurn God's love to chase after other lovers. We habitually commit spiritual adultery against God, and when we do, we break his heart. Last week, I said what makes Hosea unique is that Hosea actually gives us insight. It gives us a glimpse of the struggle that God goes through because of our sin. We get insight into the struggle that God goes through as a betrayed husband who doesn't want to let his wife go. We're going to get a small glimpse of that this week. Just a small glimpse. And I'm going to just shoot straight with you. We're not going to fully understand it until later in the story as it unfolds in chapters 2 through 3. So, now, if you struggled last week with God's command for Hosea to marry an adulterous wife, this week's going to be really hard because we're really going to struggle with the names of these children. Okay? And I'm going to have you stand for the reading of God's Word. We're going to look at Hosea 1, and I'm going to read verses 2 through chapter 2, verse 1. When the Lord first spoke through Hosea, the Lord said to Hosea, "Go, take to yourself a wife of whoredom, and have children of whoredom, for the land commits great whoredom by forsaking the Lord." So he went and took Gomer, the daughter of Diblaim, and she conceived and bore him a son. And the Lord said to him, "Call his name Jezreel, for in just a little while I will punish the house of Jehu for the blood of Jezreel, and I will put an end to the kingdom of the house of Israel. And on that day I will break the bow of Israel in the valley of Jezreel." She conceived again and bore a daughter. And the Lord said to him, "Call her name No Mercy. For I will no more have mercy on the house of Israel to forgive them at all. But I will have mercy on the house of Judah, and I will save them by the Lord their God. I will not save them by bow or by sword or by war or by horses or by horsemen." When she had weaned No Mercy, she conceived and bore a son. And the Lord said, "Call his name Not My People. For you are not my people, and I am not your God. Yet the number of the children of Israel shall be like the sand of the sea, which cannot be measured or numbered. And in the place where it was said to them, 'You are not my people,' it shall be said to them, 'Children of the living God.' And the children of Judah and the children of Israel shall be gathered together, and they shall appoint for themselves one head, and they shall go up or rise up from the land. For great shall be the day of Jezreel. Say to your brothers, 'You are my people,' and to your sisters, 'You have received mercy.'" This is the word of the Lord. All right, now before I start, I do have to say this. I have two things to say. First of all, I have yet to acknowledge college football season because college football does not officially start until October 24th. When the Big Ten and Penn State begin their schedules. So, second thing is, last week I should have warned you that Hosea is an R-rated book, and this sermon this morning is going to be R-rated too. So, I should have warned you all that last week. But here we go. Remember, we don't know if Gomer was a prostitute or if she's just simply an adulteress. We don't know if she was a harlot before they got married or she became one after. But our text, it seems to be indicating that she committed adultery after she gave birth to her first son. Look at verse 3. She conceived and bore him. Bore who? To who? Hosea. She conceived and bore him a son. So Jezreel is Hosea's son. But look at the description in verse 6 and the description in verse 8. She conceived and bore a daughter. She conceived and bore a son. It doesn't say that she bore him, Hosea, a daughter. It doesn't say she bore him, Hosea, a son. Now, it's possible that all three could be his, and the writer's just simply shortening it and leaving that part out, but I don't think it is. I think the second and third children are not his. Because look at verse 3 again. Hosea isn't just marrying a wife of whoredom. He will have children of whoredom because they are going to be associated with their mother's adultery. God, let that sink in for a moment. If two of life's most emotional experiences are getting married and having children, can you imagine the emotions that Hosea is going through? Can you imagine looking at these two children, knowing they're not yours? They were fathered by other men. Now, I can't imagine what that would be like, but doesn't it just bother you thinking about it? I mean, doesn't this just cause a pit in your stomach where you're like, oh, this doesn't sit well, it's just not right? I mean, how in the world can Hosea even look at and love his wife? And then how in the world can he even look at and love those two kids? Because every time he looks at him, what are they a reminder of? They're a reminder of his wife's unfaithfulness. They're a reminder of her betrayal to him. I mean, this is gut-wrenching. This is so raw. This is so real that it's hard to believe that this is even in the Bible. But remember, God is the one who commanded Hosea to marry a woman who was going to be unfaithful to him. And Hosea obeys, knowing she would be. He obeys, and he marries Gomer, and according to verse 3, it's because Gomer is going to do to Hosea what Israel does and continues to do to God. Israel plays the whore by forsaking God and turning to other false gods. So Hosea's marriage is a living parable of God's relationship to his people. What Hosea experiences with Gomer is what God experiences with us. And next week, we're going to dive more deeply into what Israel's spiritual adultery really is. But this week, what do we simply know? We know that Gomer's betrayal and her unfaithfulness has produced children that are not Hosea's. And the names of these children are absolutely shocking and horrifying. Now, when I was studying this, okay, a thought hit me, and it may come across as funny, but it's not really meant to be funny, okay? Because the thought that hit me was, man, could you imagine Hosea at the park with his kids? And another mom comes up and sits next to him and says, hey, which ones are yours? And Hosea points to the bigger kid, picking on the smaller kid, and he says, that one right there, his name's Bloodshed. And that girl over there with no one to push her on the swing, her name is Not Loved. And the boy sitting by himself over there with no friends, Not Mine. See, the naming of these three kids is God's word to unfaithful Israel. And it gets worse with each name. So let's look a little more closely at the meaning of each name. The first son, Jezreel, man, his name, it means to plant or to scatter. But Jezreel is not really a formal name, it's a place. It's a place with a checkered past. Jezreel is a fertile valley that is near Mount Gilboa. And there were many significant and yet violent events that happened in this valley. See, the valley of Jezreel, it's where Deborah and where Gideon fought in the book of Judges. And the First Kings is the place where the Philistines defeated Israel and killed Saul and his sons. It's where Naboth had his vineyard until he was framed and murdered by agents of Queen Jezebel. It's where Jehu killed Queen Jezebel, Ahab, and the rest of their supporters, which was in the hundreds. So this place has come to be associated with violence and bloodshed. I mean, it would kind of be like the way we think of Chernobyl today. When you hear the word Chernobyl, you automatically think disaster, nuclear disaster, right? Look at verses 4 through 5. Hosea is told by God to name his son Jezreel. Why? Because in a little while I will punish the house of Jehu for the blood of Jezreel. And I will put an end to the kingdom of the house of Israel. And on that day I will break the bow of Israel in the valley of Jezreel. So notice, it's not just the family of Jehu that's going to be punished here, but the whole political entity of Israel is going to be brought down. See, the bow was a symbol of military strength. So usually whenever the bow is mentioned or breaking of the bow is mentioned in the Old Testament, it's meant to show that God is going to protect Israel by breaking the bow of Israel's enemies. But it's not the bow of Israel's enemies that he's going to break. It's going to be Israel's bow. Which means Israel is going to be left defenseless. And in the valley of Jezreel, Israel's going to fall, which they do in 722 BC to Assyria. But there's one more thing, because Israel doesn't, in Hebrew, they don't pronounce the letter J. So, but in Hebrew, it's Yisrael, which sounds an awful like Israel, right? So it's a pun. So what God is saying is that you're not Israel, you're Jezreel. Bloodshed. I'm not going to plant you, I'm going to scatter you. So the naming of Jezreel is the message that God's judgment is coming. It's coming for Israel because of her sins. But then it gets worse with the second child, does it not? God commands this child, a daughter, and here's the Hebrew name, Lo Ruhamah, which means unloved, no compassion, no mercy. Can you imagine a little girl being named not loved? See, Hosea is not her father. She's the child of adultery. She's the child of unfaithfulness. She's the child of a brutal betrayal. And this name is not just startling, it's tragic. Because this name cuts deeper than Jezreel, doesn't it? I mean, it's one thing to lose a war in your kingdom. And isn't it more tragic to lose the mercy, the compassion, and the love of God? See, this name communicates rejection and abandonment, doesn't it? This name communicates a heart with no affection for. And this is not only troubling, but how can this be? Well, men, I'm going to ask you this. If you were Hosea, could you love the child of your wife's adulterer? See, doesn't this name force us to face something? Doesn't it force us to face how heinous and how serious our sin is to God? If we do not repent and return to God, but if we keep running away from God without any regard for God, it's a dangerous place to be. Because lo ruchama is an expression of God's opposition to our spiritual adultery. You see, in his jealousy as a betrayed husband, God withholds mercy. And I know this is troubling, but we need to sit in the tension of this. And the reason why is because our sin is a big deal to God. It really is. But unfortunately, we take it too lightly. We think it's not that big of a deal to turn away from God. But what's Hosea showing us? No, it's a really big deal. Why? Because when you turn away from God, what are you doing? You're turning towards something else. You're saying, God, you're not good enough. God, you can't give me what I need. God, you can't satisfy me like something else can, so I'm going to chase after other lovers without any regard for you. All sin, in other words, is what? Spiritual adultery. And because it is spiritual adultery, as our heavenly husband, God cannot be indifferent to our sin. He cannot dismiss our sin. Our sin pains him. Our sin wounds him. Our sin breaks God's heart. And because it does, our spiritual adultery deserves to be punished. But I want us to notice something in verse 6, because I think, I'm going to argue, that we're getting a little glimpse of the struggle that God goes through here. Okay? See, this verse is much debated, and scholars don't know how to interpret or translate it, because they don't know what to do with it. Because this verse seems like a contradiction. The daughter is named Lo Ruchama, no mercy. Why? Because God will no longer have mercy and compassion upon Israel. And it's the next phrase that's the debate, that they don't know what to do with it. So they add a negative to it. They add a negative to the word forgive. So that's why in the ESV it says, nor will I forgive them at all. But the straightforward reading of it is in the Hebrew, I will completely forgive. And we're like, wait, what? God will have no mercy on Israel, and then without explanation, I will completely forgive them. That doesn't make sense. That doesn't go together. That's a contradiction, right? Well, maybe we're being given a glimpse of the struggle that takes place within God. As Israel's heavenly husband, he's been betrayed. His heart is broken. His people are loveless towards him, so he will no longer have compassion or mercy towards them. But then, he's moved to completely forgive them, because he can't let them go. So, why do we think it can't be both? That was a question I had to ask the commentaries that I read. Why do you think it can't be both? I think it is both. And I know that if it is both, then this creates a tension that's not easy to resolve, right? And if it's a tension that's not easily resolved, then look at how it would change the meaning of verse 6 and verse 7. If the ending of verse 6 is, I will completely forgive them, then verse 7 is not contrasted to verse 6. Verse 7 is connected to verse 6. So what I think is going on here is God is saying, I will completely forgive all of my people, including Judah. He will have mercy on the house of Judah as well. And he will save them not by military strength, through the bow, through the sword, through war, through the horse or the horseman. No, God himself will save them by being their God. Salvation does not come through military might. It comes through the God who is merciful. But we still got one more child to go, and this one's the most troubling. After Gomer had weaned, now in these days they weaned them for at least 3 years, so it's just telling us this is the length of time. After Gomer had weaned no mercy, lo ruchama, she bore a son who God commands to name Lo Ami, not my people. For you are not my people, and I am not your God. This is the most troubling name, is it not? Because it seems like God had just issued and signed Israel's divorce papers. The great I am, Yahweh. In Exodus 6, verse 7 says, you shall be my people, and I shall be your God, period. The God who entered into a covenant with Israel to be with Israel, to be for Israel, is now no longer with and for Israel. And the naming of this child, not mine, is God declaring the covenant he made with Israel is now null and void. God is now rejecting and abandoning his people. God is now leaving them to their own devices. Doesn't this seem to go against everything that we know about God? Doesn't this seem to contradict the kind of covenant that God made with Israel? Because the covenant that God made with Abraham was a covenant of grace. It's not a covenant of works. So did God's grace reach its limit and run out and he's had enough? I mean, if God graciously promised to be their God no matter what, then is God breaking his promise? Because Israel has been unfaithful to him? Is it possible for God to reject, to abandon, and divorce his bride? See the tension that this book raises? See, this is not easy to resolve. And people try to resolve it and downplay something. They try to downplay God's reaction to sin, and they try to downplay the seriousness of what these names mean. And I want us to understand something. What God does to Israel is more than discipline. It's way more than discipline. It's punishment. See, what happened to Israel in 722 BC, it's almost complete destruction. Assyria was the most feared and violent, vicious people in the known world, and they laid siege to Israel. Thousands died of starvation. Thousands died of slaughter. Their women were raped. Most of them were carried and taken away into exile, never to return. Those who stayed intermarried with the Assyrians, and what do we call them? The Samaritans. This is destruction. And what makes this so troubling is the fact that Israel has become like the pagan Gentiles. But I got to be honest, what makes it even more troubling is what this shows us. Sin cannot be cured. It must be destroyed. And the message of the three children is that God will destroy our spiritual adultery. But man, praise God, the story doesn't end there, right? Whew, thank you for verse 10. But we got to understand this. The story continues, right, with the hope of what? The hope of God bringing about a resurrection. God bringing about a restoration after destruction. See, this is the point of verse 10 through chapter 2, verse 1. Because again, this is a tension, right? In the same breath that the Lord utters his detachment from Israel, in the very same breath, he uses the language of the Abrahamic covenant to articulate the basis for its restoration. Yet, the number of the children of Israel shall be like the sand on the sea, which cannot be measured or numbered. This is a phrase that every patriarch was said. God said this to. Some he took them out and he said, look, I want you to look at the stars. Try to count them if you can. That's how many descendants you're going to have. Or look at the sands on the seashore. Can you count all of them? No, it's a number that is innumerable, too big to count. So what are we seeing here? The Lord will judge. Fact. But the covenant promise of grace still stands. Fact. Look at the promise of the three reversals here, and then this will make more sense. The first one in verse 10, and in the place where it was said to them, you are not my people, it shall be said to them, children of the living God. So a rejected people is going to be called children of the living God. And then the second reversal, a divided people will become a united people again, but a united people under one head. And look at this phrase, and they shall go up from the land. Literally, they shall rise up. So this is not just a return to the land from exile. This is a resurrection. This is a rising up to newness of life. And when that happens, great will be the day of Jezreel. You see, Jezreel has been associated with bloodshed, right? But now it's going to be known for its original meaning, God plants. Which means he's predicting in the future a resurrected, restored, and renewed people who God will plant, and they will flourish because of God's presence with them. Third reversal, chapter 2, verse 1. Say to your brothers, you are my people. And say to your sisters, you have received mercy. Those who are not loved will receive mercy and be loved by God. See, Hosea's prophecy of judgment and God's promise of grace, they stand side by side, and they are both simultaneously true. The reality of destruction with the renewal, resurrection, and restoration is a tension that cannot and will not be resolved in Hosea's day. In fact, it will remain unresolved for over 700 years until the only true and faithful Son comes and takes on flesh. You see, Joseph was told to name the child that was not his Jesus. Yeshua. Hosea. Why? Because Jesus would save his people from their sins. In other words, Jesus is God with us and God for us. Jesus came to destroy our sin and spiritual adultery against God. But how? By becoming our sin. And by becoming our sin, Jesus received God's judgment, and his blood was shed. On the cross, Jesus became Jezreel. On the cross, he became not loved, and he received no mercy. Jesus was rejected, he was abandoned, and he was cut off. In other words, on the cross, both God's judgment and mercy meet. The tension can only be resolved on the cross. And because the tension is resolved on the cross, 3 days later, Jesus, as the true Israel, the true Son, God resurrected him. Which means the great day of Jezreel is now. It's here. It's right now. And we're a part of it. You see, God is now planting a renewed and restored people who trust in Jesus and are led by one head, one king. Jesus and this united people is now made up of Jews and Gentiles. You see, Paul in Romans 9, he quotes Hosea 1 here. In Romans 9, he quotes Hosea 1 to show how the church is the fulfillment of Hosea's prophecy and promise. Because he says, as Hosea said, those who were not my people, I will call my people. And her who was not loved, I will call my beloved. And the very place where it was said to them, you are not my people, there they will be called children of the living God. In other words, today you and I are a part of Hosea's story. As Gentiles, we once were not God's people. But now we are called God's people. There was a time where we as Gentiles were not loved by God. But now we are called beloved of God. The church is now called the children of the living God. Which means, brothers and sisters, here when you see that Jesus became your sin, that Jesus took all of your spiritual adultery and he shed his blood to pay the price for it. When you see that he did that so that you could become a child of God who receives mercy, when you see that, now that you are his child, and you turn away from him to chase after other lovers, the call to you, the call to me, the call of the book of Hosea is return, come back to your heavenly husband, because he will take you back. No other husband would love an unfaithful wife. No other father would love children who are not his. Only the living God pays the ultimate price to win you back. Only the living, loving God of grace can say to you, you are mine. I am yours. I purchased you because you are my beloved. Amen.